The silent watcher. The basketball bounced rhythmically against the pavement, the sound echoing through the quiet suburban street. Jonathan Barrow wiped the sweat from his forehead, his sneakers squeaking against the concrete as he pivoted. He was determined to improve his shooting skills before tryouts next month. With a deep breath, he lined up his shot, releasing the ball with perfect form. The orange sphere arched through the air before rattling against the rim and falling through the net. "Yes," he whispered under his breath, pumping his fist in victory. But as he jogged to retrieve the ball, a strange sensation crept over him, like an itch at the back of his mind. Someone was watching him. He turned his head sharply, scanning the street. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the row of houses, the neatly trimmed lawns, and the occasional parked car. Then he spotted her. A little girl stood motionless across the street, half hidden behind a maple tree. She was wearing a light blue dress, her dark hair neatly braided. Her large, solemn eyes were locked onto him, unmoving. Jonathan felt his stomach do an uncomfortable flip. Who was she? He pretended to focus on his basketball, bouncing it a few times before stealing another glance at her. She hadn't moved. She just stood there, silent as a statue, watching him. His throat felt dry. Maybe she was lost, or waiting for someone. He wasn't sure, but there was something about the way she stood there, so still, that made him uneasy. Deciding to ignore her, he turned back to his game. The ball thumped against the pavement as he dribbled to the left, practicing his footwork. But no matter how much he tried to focus, the weight of her gaze made it impossible. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Jonathan gripped the ball against his hip and looked at her directly. "Hey," he called out. "Are you okay?" The girl flinched, as if startled. For a second, she hesitated, shifting from foot to foot like she was deciding whether to stay or run. Then, without a word, she turned and walked briskly down the sidewalk, disappearing around the corner. Jonathan exhaled, unsure whether to feel relieved or more unsettled. "That was weird," he muttered. That night at dinner, Jonathan couldn't shake the memory of the girl. Even as he sat at the table, pushing peas around his plate, his mind kept replaying the way she had watched him, her expression unreadable, her posture rigid. His mother, Sarah Barrow, noticed his distraction. "Something wrong, sweetie?" she asked, pouring him a glass of water. Jonathan hesitated, then shook his head. "Just tired," he mumbled. His father, Officer Robert Barrow, raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jonathan forced a chuckle. "No, nothing like that. Just some girl was standing across the street watching me while I was playing basketball. It was weird." His parents exchanged a glance. "Did she say anything to you?" his father asked, setting down his fork. "No," Jonathan said. "I tried to ask if she was okay, but she just walked away." His dad frowned, rubbing his chin. "Maybe a new kid in the neighborhood," he mused. "I'll check around, see if anyone knows her." Jonathan nodded, but something told him this wasn't just a coincidence. He had a sinking feeling in his gut that he hadn't seen the last of her. The following days, Jonathan's suspicion proved correct. The girl started appearing everywhere. The next morning, as he walked to school, he spotted her sitting on a bench near the crossing guard. She was in the same blue dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Their eyes met for just a moment before she quickly looked away. "Hey, Tommy," Jonathan nudged his best friend as they waited for the pedestrian signal. "See that girl over there?" Tommy glanced up from his phone. "Who?" Jonathan looked again. She was gone. He blinked, confused. Never mind. At the park after school, Jonathan was playing soccer with his friends when he felt that same familiar stare. He turned toward the edge of the playground and saw her standing near the oak trees, half hidden behind the thick trunk. The uneasy feeling returned. Jonathan's swing slowed, his feet dragging in the wood chips. He was tired of feeling paranoid. "Hey," he called out, marching toward her. But just like before, the second he spoke, She turned and walked away. This was getting ridiculous. That evening, she was there again. Jonathan was helping his mom bring in groceries from the car when he caught sight of her standing near the mailbox at the end of the street. She was closer this time, still watching. His mom followed his gaze. "Who are you looking at?" Jonathan's chest tightened. "That girl. The one by the mailbox." His mother squinted but didn't react. "I don't see anyone, honey." Jonathan looked again. The mailbox stood empty. No girl. His breath hitched. Was he imagining her? He clenched his fists, feeling frustrated. "I swear she was just there." His father overheard. "That's the second time you've mentioned her," he said, his cop instincts kicking in. "Maybe I should ask around. See if any neighbors have noticed anything strange." Jonathan shrugged. "I don't know, Dad. It's just weird." His father studied him for a moment, then patted his shoulder. "Well, if she's just a lost kid, we'll find out soon enough." But Jonathan wasn't so sure. One rainy evening, a few nights later, the sky was dark with thick storm clouds, rain hammering against the house. Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, struggling with his math homework while his mother prepared dinner. The steady drumming of raindrops against the window made the house feel warm and safe. Then, lightning flashed. For a split second, the entire street outside was illuminated in a bright white glow. Jonathan's heart stopped. A small figure was huddled on their front porch steps. His blood ran cold. No, not her. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly. "Mom," he called out, his voice shaky. "Come look." His mother hurried over, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it?" Jonathan pointed to the front door. Through the rain-streaked window, the little girl sat curled up on the steps, her blue dress soaked through, her dark braids hanging limp. She was shivering. Jonathan's mother gasped. "Oh my goodness." Without hesitation, she rushed to the door. "Grab a blanket, Jonathan." He didn't move for a second, frozen in shock. Why was she here? Why now? Shaking himself out of his daze, he sprinted to the living room and grabbed the soft blue throw blanket from the couch. By the time he returned, his mother had already pulled the door open. Rain poured into the house as she knelt beside the trembling girl. "You poor thing," she murmured, wrapping the blanket around the child's small shoulders. "Come inside, sweetheart. You must be freezing." Jonathan watched in stunned silence as the girl hesitated, her dark eyes darting between them. Then, slowly, she stood on trembling legs and stepped inside. Water dripped onto the floor as she clutched the blanket tighter. Jonathan could see her more clearly now. Small, fragile, her lips slightly purple from the cold. His mother's voice was gentle as she knelt beside her. "Can you tell us your name, sweetie?" The girl swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "Maya." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The girl who had been following him for days, the girl who had haunted his every step, had finally spoken. And now she was standing in his home. Shadows of the past. The rain continued to pound against the windows as Jonathan stood in the entryway, his heart racing. Maya, the silent girl who had been watching him for days, was now inside his house. She stood motionless, shivering slightly despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. His mother, Sarah Barrow, knelt beside her, her concern evident. "Maya, sweetheart, you must be freezing." She gently rubbed Maya's arms through the blanket. "Let's get you warmed up." Maya didn't respond. Her dark eyes flickered toward Jonathan, then down to the floor. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure what to say. What could he say? This girl had been following him, appearing everywhere he went, only to show up on his doorstep in the middle of a storm. Now she was in his house, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. His father, Officer Robert Barrow, entered the room, his police instincts on high alert. His sharp gaze took in the scene. The soaked girl, his wife's worried expression, Jonathan's confusion. "What's going on?" he asked. She was outside, his mother explained, just sitting on our steps in the rain. His father's eyes darkened with concern. What were you doing out there, Maya? The girl didn't answer. Sarah Barrow rose to her feet, offering a reassuring smile. Come on, let's get you dry. You can borrow some of my old clothes for now. She turned to Jonathan. Sweetheart, why don't you grab a towel from the bathroom? Jonathan hesitated, but then nodded. Yeah, okay. As he turned to leave, he stole another glance at Maya. Her small frame seemed to shrink under the blanket. There was something about her silence, something heavy, something broken, a home that isn't home. Minutes later, Maya sat at the kitchen table, now dressed in a pair of Jonathan's old sweatpants and a long-sleeved shirt that practically swallowed her tiny frame. Her damp braids clung to her shoulders as she gripped a steaming cup of hot chocolate between her small hands. Jonathan sat across from her, watching as his mother busied herself at the stove. His father leaned against the counter, arms crossed, studying Maya carefully. Where do you live, Maya? Officer Barrow asked. For a long moment, Maya said nothing. Then, barely above a whisper, she murmured, I don't have anywhere. Jonathan's chest tightened. His mother turned sharply, her expression filled with worry. You don't have a home. Sweetheart, where have you been staying? Maya's fingers tightened around the mug. Different places, she said softly. Sometimes shelters, sometimes outside. Jonathan felt a lump form in his throat. He thought about all the times he had seen her, watching him from a distance, hiding behind trees, standing near the school. He had thought she was following him for some strange reason, but now he realized. She had been surviving, living in the shadows, alone. His father's voice was gentle but firm. Maya, where are your parents? Maya swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the swirling marshmallows in her hot chocolate. My mom. She died when I was little, she whispered. And my dad. Jonathan noticed the way her hands trembled slightly. He was a police officer, Maya finally said. Like you. Jonathan's breath hitched. His father straightened. What was his name? Maya hesitated before answering. Richard Thompson. A heavy silence filled the kitchen. Jonathan watched as his father's expression changed, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening with something deep and unreadable. Then, in a low voice, his father whispered, Richard was my partner. Jonathan's stomach dropped. Partner. That meant his father had known Maya's dad, had worked beside him, had maybe even. Jonathan's father ran a hand down his face, his usual composed expression faltering. His voice was thick with emotion. Richard was one of the best men I ever knew. Maya bit her lip, her eyes welling with unshed tears. He told me, if anything ever happened to him, there was a family I could trust. She swallowed hard. A police family. Jonathan's chest tightened. That's why you've been watching me, he realized, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Maya nodded slightly. I wanted to make sure I had the right family. Jonathan suddenly felt sick. All this time, he had been so focused on how strange it was to be watched that he hadn't stopped to think about why. She had been looking for safety. For them. For him. Unfinished promises. Officer Barrow sat down heavily in the chair beside Maya, rubbing his temples. I should have known, he muttered. After Richard died, I tried to find out what happened to Maya, but they told me she was placed with a relative. Maya's fingers curled around her mug. Aunt Denise. Jonathan saw something dark flash across Maya's face. She didn't want me, she continued. She only took me because of the money. My dad's pension. But when it ran out, she sent me away. Jonathan's stomach twisted with anger. She just left you? His mother asked, horrified. Maya nodded. She told me to figure it out on my own. Jonathan clenched his fists under the table. His father exhaled sharply. I should have looked harder, he admitted, his voice filled with regret. I promised Richard. I promised him if anything ever happened, I'd make sure you were safe. Maya's voice cracked. Nobody wanted me. Jonathan's heart felt like it was breaking. His father shook his head. That's not true. He looked at Maya with fierce determination. We want you. Maya's eyes flickered with something unreadable. His mother nodded, her voice soft. You're not alone anymore, sweetheart. Jonathan swallowed hard, then spoke before he could overthink it. You can stay here. Maya blinked at him, as if she hadn't expected those words. Jonathan's mom gave him a proud look before turning back to Maya. He's right, she said. You don't have to be scared anymore. Maya looked down at her mug again. What if they don't let me? She whispered. Jonathan frowned. Who? Maya hesitated. The system, she said finally. The foster people. They'll take me away. They always do. A heavy silence followed. Jonathan's father sat back, rubbing his chin. It won't be easy, he admitted. But I'm going to fight for you, Maya. I made a promise to your father, and I don't break promises. Maya's lips trembled. You really mean that? Officer Barrow's voice was firm. Yes. Maya bit her lip, her eyes shining with emotion. For the first time, Jonathan saw something shift in her expression. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. A new beginning, or an old threat. The next morning, Jonathan woke up to find Maya sitting at the kitchen table, eating toast with peanut butter. She looked different, a little less tense, a little more at ease. His mother smiled as she set down a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her. Eat as much as you want, sweetheart. Maya hesitated, then took a small bite. Thank you, she said softly. Jonathan sat across from her, watching as she carefully chewed. It was strange. Just days ago, she had been a mystery, a shadow in the background of his life. Now she was here, in his home, part of his family. As they ate, his father came into the kitchen, his face serious. I made some calls, he said. Jonathan immediately felt a sense of dread. His father sighed. Child Services is involved now. They want to assess the situation. Maya stiffened. Jonathan's mother placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. It's okay, sweetheart. We'll figure this out. His father hesitated. But there's something else. Jonathan's stomach churned. What? Officer Barrow exhaled. Maya's aunt, Denise, she found out where she is. Maya's fork clattered against the plate. She wants her back. A battle for home. The morning air inside the Barrow household was thick with tension. Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, barely able to finish his breakfast, while Maya pushed scrambled eggs around her plate, barely eating it all. His mother, Sarah, kept glancing toward his father, waiting for him to say something reassuring. But his father, Officer Robert Barrow, was lost in thought, gripping a steaming cup of coffee in both hands. His usual steady demeanor was shaken, his brows furrowed deep. Jonathan finally broke the silence. Dad, what do you mean Aunt Denise wants Maya back? His voice came out sharper than he intended. Maya flinched, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. Officer Barrow exhaled. She contacted Child Services last night. They're sending a social worker to check on Maya today. Jonathan's chest tightened. He knew what that meant. Maya could be taken away. No, he said immediately. She doesn't want Maya. She just wants. He stopped himself before saying it, but everyone at the table already knew. The money. Maya's father's pension and benefits. Maya's hands clenched into fists on her lap. She never cared about me, she said softly. She only took me in because of the money. And when it ran out, her voice cracked, but she swallowed hard and continued. She dumped me. Jonathan's mother reached across the table, squeezing Maya's hand. Sweetheart, you don't have to go back there. We're going to fight for you. Maya's lower lip trembled. But what if they don't let me stay? A long silence followed. Officer Barrow finally spoke. Maya, the law can be complicated. Foster care, custody battles. It's not always about what's right. His jaw tightened, But I'm not going to stand by and let them take you from a safe home and put you somewhere you don't belong. Maya nodded, but she looked unconvinced. Jonathan clenched his fists. He wasn't going to let her be taken away. Not after everything. Not after she had finally found where she belonged. A stranger at the door. A few hours later, the doorbell rang. Jonathan's heart pounded as he saw his father straighten his police badge before heading for the door. His mother smoothed her dress, then gently touched Maya's shoulder. "It's going to be okay," she whispered. Maya barely nodded. Jonathan followed them to the door, not wanting to be left out. When his father opened it, a tall woman stood on the porch. She was wearing a navy blue blazer, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun. She held a clipboard in one hand and a large brown purse in the other. "Good morning," she said, her voice professional, but not unkind. "I'm Miss Winston from Child Protective Services." Officer Barrow nodded. "Come in." Miss Winston stepped inside, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the house. Jonathan saw the way she observed everything. The neatness of the living room, the framed family photos on the wall, the warmth of the home. Maya shrank back slightly, her fingers twisting in her borrowed sweatshirt. Miss Winston smiled at her. "You must be Maya." Maya hesitated before nodding. "I know this must be scary," Miss Winston said gently. "I'm just here to talk and make sure everything is okay. Would you mind if we spoke privately for a bit?" Maya's shoulders tensed, but she nodded. His mother squeezed Maya's hand one last time before Maya followed Miss Winston into the living room. Jonathan sat down next to his father, his leg bouncing restlessly. "What are they talking about?" he whispered. His father sighed. "Everything. Where she's been. How she feels about staying here. If she feels safe." "She does feel safe here," Jonathan said quickly. His father gave him a sad smile. "I know. But it's not just about feelings, son. It's about what the law says." Jonathan clenched his fists. "Well, the law is wrong." His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, but Jonathan didn't relax. Because deep down, he had a terrible, gnawing feeling. What if they lost? Maya's story. Maya sat on the couch, feeling the weight of Miss Winston's gaze as the woman flipped through papers on her clipboard. "Maya," Miss Winston started, "can you tell me about your time with your Aunt Denise?" Maya swallowed hard. Her hands felt cold. She hated talking about it. "She took me in after my dad died," Maya said slowly. "But she didn't really want me." Miss Winston tilted her head. "What makes you say that, sweetheart?" Maya hesitated, then forced herself to be brave. "She didn't talk to me much. She kept me in my room a lot. Sometimes she forgot to buy food." She looked down at her lap. "She only started being nice when social workers came. She made sure I looked clean and happy for them. But when they left, she didn't finish. She didn't have to." Miss Winston's expression softened, and when the money stopped coming, Maya's throat tightened. "She told me to leave." Miss Winston was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "And how do you feel about living with the Barrow family?" Maya sat up straighter. "I feel safe here," she said immediately. "Mrs. Barrow helps me with my hair in the mornings. Mr. Barrow tells funny stories at dinner. And Jonathan," she hesitated, then smiled a little. "Jonathan makes me feel like I have a brother." Miss Winston smiled gently. "That's good to hear." Maya bit her lip. "Please, don't make me go back." Miss Winston sighed. "Maya, I promise I'll do everything I can to help. But this isn't just my decision. The law has rules, and your aunt is still your legal guardian." She hesitated. "Unless we can prove she's unfit." Maya's heart pounded. "How do we do that?" Miss Winston studied her for a moment. "Do you have any proof? Something that shows she neglected you? Photos, notes, anything?" Maya felt her stomach drop. She had nothing. The evidence they needed. Jonathan watched as Miss Winston left, a polite but unreadable expression on her face. His father closed the door behind her, rubbing his temples. She's going to file her report, he said. But she said we need proof. Real proof. His mother's face fell. How are we supposed to prove what happened to Maya if there's no one to back it up? Jonathan frowned. Then, slowly, an idea started forming in his mind. I think I know someone who can help. His parents turned to him. Maya, Jonathan said, turning to face her. You said your Aunt Denise only acted nice when social workers visited, right? Maya nodded. So maybe we can find someone who saw what she was really like. A neighbor. A teacher. Someone who noticed something off. His father's eyes lit up. That's a good idea, Jonathan. Jonathan looked at Maya. Do you remember any of your old neighbors? Someone who might have seen how she treated you? Maya's brow furrowed. Then, after a moment, her eyes widened. Mrs. Patil. Who's that? Jonathan asked. She lived in the apartment next to us. Maya explained. She was always nice to me. She used to bring me cookies and ask if I was okay. Jonathan's father nodded. That's a start. He grabbed his police radio from the counter. I'll see if I can track her down. Maya bit her lip. Do you think she'll help? Officer Barrow gave her a confident smile. I think if she knows the truth, she won't let your aunt get away with this. Jonathan turned to Maya, determination burning in his chest. We're not going to let them take you away without a fight. Maya's eyes shined with emotion. You mean that? Jonathan grinned. Of course. That's what brothers do. For the first time in days, Maya smiled. Maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. Maybe she was finally home. The fight for family. The house felt different that morning. Tense, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, his fingers drumming anxiously against the wood. Across from him, Maya was hunched over a bowl of cereal, but she barely touched it. They both knew what today was. Today was the day they fought back. Jonathan's father, Officer Robert Barrow, had spent hours the night before making phone calls, trying to track down anyone who could help prove Maya belonged with them. His mother, Sarah, had gathered every piece of paperwork they could find. School reports, medical records, even letters from their neighbors about how much Maya had flourished since living with them. But Jonathan knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. They needed more. And they had one shot to get it. A possible witness. Miss Winston from Child Protective Services had agreed to give them more time before making a final decision, but only if they could provide real evidence of Maya's mistreatment. That's where Mrs. Patil came in. She had been Maya's neighbor in the rundown apartment complex where Aunt Denise had kept her. If anyone had seen how Maya had truly lived, it was her. Officer Barrow had arranged a meeting at the cafe down the street. They didn't want Aunt Denise catching wind of their plan. So that morning, Jonathan, Maya, and his parents all piled into the car. Maya sat stiffly in the back seat, her hands gripping her seatbelt so tightly her knuckles turned white. You okay? Jonathan asked, nudging her gently. Maya hesitated before whispering, What if she doesn't remember me? Jonathan met her gaze. She will. Maya swallowed hard and nodded. But Jonathan could see the fear still lurking in her eyes. As they pulled up to the cafe, Jonathan spotted a woman sitting at a table near the window. She was older, with warm brown skin and silver-streaked hair tucked under a headscarf. A half-empty cup of tea sat in front of her, steam still rising. Maya's breath hitched. Mrs. Patil, she whispered. The truth comes out. The second they stepped inside, Mrs. Patil looked up. The moment her eyes landed on Maya, her lips parted in surprise. Maya. Maya nodded hesitantly. Mrs. Patil immediately rose from her seat, her face filled with emotion. Oh, sweetheart, she murmured, reaching for her hands. I thought about you so many times after you left. I was so worried. Maya's shoulders relaxed just a little. You were. Of course, Mrs. Patil said firmly. She turned to Officer Barrow. You said you wanted to talk about what happened to her. Yes, Officer Barrow said, setting down a folder on the table. Maya's aunt is trying to take her back. but we know she wasn't treated well there. We need someone to confirm that." Mrs. Patel's face darkened. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. "I don't just remember," she said, flipping through pages. "I wrote it down." Maya gasped. "You?" Mrs. Patel nodded. "When I noticed things weren't right, I started keeping notes. Just in case. I used to be a social worker before I retired. I knew what I was seeing." Jonathan leaned in as she turned the notebook toward them. December 14. Maya outside in the cold for over an hour. No coat. Locked out. January 2. Heard yelling through the walls. Maya crying. February 5. Maya asked to borrow food. Said she hadn't eaten that day. March 11. Maya left alone overnight. Jonathan's blood boiled as he read the list. "You can you?" he blurted out, trying to control his anger. Mrs. Patel's face was sorrowful. "I reported it once, but nothing came of it. I didn't have enough proof at the time." Officer Barrow took the notebook carefully. This is what we needed." Mrs. Patel nodded. "I'll testify. I'll tell them exactly what I saw." Maya exhaled sharply, like she'd been holding her breath for hours. For the first time, they had real proof. Aunt Denise's trap. But the battle wasn't over yet. When they got home, the house phone was ringing. Sarah Barrow picked it up. "Hello." Silence. Then a cold, clipped voice. "This is Denise Watson. I want my niece." Jonathan's fists clenched. Sarah's expression hardened. "Denise, you abandoned her." Denise scoffed. "She was difficult. She was a child." Sarah snapped. Denise's tone turned sharp. "It doesn't matter. She's mine. Legally. And I already have a court hearing scheduled for next week. You can't keep her from me." Maya, who had been standing nearby, froze. Robert Barrow took the phone. "Denise," he said evenly, "you're only after the benefits." A sickening pause. Then a smug, "Prove it." Jonathan's father smirked. "We will." And he hung up. The courtroom showdown. A week later, they stood in a cold courtroom, facing off against Aunt Denise. Jonathan sat beside Maya, gripping her hand tightly as the judge entered. Denise's lawyer spoke first. "Miss Watson is the only living blood relative of the child. The law is clear. Family takes priority." Jonathan's father stood. "Family isn't just about blood. It's about who actually cares for the child." Denise scoffed. "Oh, please." That's when Mrs. Patel stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said, handing over her notebook. "This is what I saw." The judge's brows furrowed as he read. Then his eyes lifted to Denise. "Miss Watson, is this true?" Denise stammered. She. Miss Winston from Child Protective Services stood next. "Your Honor, based on this evidence, we request immediate termination of Denise Watson's guardianship." Jonathan held his breath. The judge looked over the files, looked at Denise's cold expression, then at Maya's wide, fearful eyes. Then he cleared his throat. "This court finds that Denise Watson neglected the child in her care. Full custody is granted to the Barrow family." The room erupted in noise, but Jonathan barely heard any of it because Maya had thrown her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. "You're safe now," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You're really safe." And for the first time in a long time, Maya believed it. She was home. For good. A new beginning. A final threat. Maya sat motionless in the courtroom, her heart pounding so loud she swore the judge could hear it. Her small fingers dug into the fabric of her borrowed dress, one Mrs. Barrow had picked out just for today. She couldn't look at Aunt Denise, couldn't bear to see her smirk or hear the arrogant way she had spoken all morning, acting like Maya was some object she was owed. But then, full custody is granted to the Barrow family. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Did she hear that right? She turned, her wide eyes locking onto Jonathan, who was grinning so wide his cheeks looked like they might split. His mother had clasped both hands over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. His father, usually so composed, exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging in relief. And then, just like that, everything in Maya's body unclenched. Tears blurred her vision as she lunged forward, throwing her arms around Jonathan, sobbing into his shoulder. "We did it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We really did it." Jonathan hugged her back just as fiercely. "Yeah," he choked out. "We did." For the first time in what felt like forever, Maya let herself believe it. She had a home. Aunt Denise's final stand. The celebration didn't last long. From across the courtroom, Aunt Denise shot up from her chair. "This is ridiculous," she barked, her heels clicking furiously against the polished floor as she stormed toward the judge's bench. Maya tensed, instinctively gripping Jonathan's sleeve. The judge remained calm, adjusting his glasses as he regarded Denise coolly. "Miss Watson, I suggest you compose yourself. This is illegal. I'm her blood. You can't just take her away from me," Denise screeched, pointing a manicured finger toward Maya. Officer Barrow stepped forward, his broad frame blocking Maya from view. His voice was like steel. "You lost, Denise. And let's be honest, you never wanted Maya. You wanted the check that came with her." Denise's face twisted in rage. "You." The judge slammed his gavel. "Enough. The ruling stands. If you continue to disrupt this courtroom, I will hold you in contempt." Denise's mouth opened, but for the first time, no words came out. She had lost. Maya could see it in the way her aunt's shoulders suddenly slumped, the way her eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out. There wasn't one. It was over. Denise let out a sharp breath and turned on her heel, marching toward the exit without another word. But just before she disappeared, she paused at the door. Maya's stomach churned as her aunt turned her head ever so slightly and muttered under her breath, "You think you've won, little girl." A slow, cruel smile stretched across her lips. "We'll see." And then she was gone. Maya sat frozen in place, her hands gripping the armrest so tight her knuckles turned white. Jonathan must have seen her reaction because he leaned in. "Hey," he whispered, nudging her shoulder. "She's bluffing. She can't hurt you anymore." Maya swallowed hard, nodding. But deep down, a tiny part of her wasn't so sure. A home at last. The drive home felt like a dream. Maya sat in the back seat of the Barrows car, watching the city blur past. For so long, she had feared being uprooted, shuffled between homes, never knowing if she was safe. But now she belonged somewhere. The car pulled into the familiar driveway of the blue house on Cedar Street. Jonathan practically bounced out of the car before opening Maya's door with a dramatic flourish. "Welcome home, Maya Barrow," he announced, grinning. Maya let out a watery laugh as she stepped onto the pavement, her chest warm and light. Home. She had never felt the weight of that word until now. Sarah Barrow wrapped an arm around her. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go inside." As they stepped through the front door, something inside Maya shifted. The familiar smell of fresh-baked cookies greeted her nose. The cozy warmth of the house wrapped around her like a blanket. The walls were lined with family photos, and Maya knew, soon, her face would be among them. Sarah gently nudged her forward. "We have one last surprise for you." Maya blinked. "What?" Jonathan smirked. "Go upstairs and find out." Heart pounding, Maya climbed the stairs, her hand trailing against the wooden railing. She stopped just outside the guest room, the room she had been staying in. Only now, the sign on the door had changed. Instead of guest room, there was a small wooden plaque. Maya's room. Her throat tightened. She pushed the door open and gasped. The room had been transformed. The walls had been repainted a soft lavender, her favorite color. A bookshelf stood in the corner, already filled with books. A fluffy comforter with little stars covered the bed, and a brand-new stuffed bear sat on the pillow. Tears filled her eyes. She turned, seeing Jonathan and his parents standing in the doorway, smiling. "You didn't have to do all this," she whispered. Sarah stepped forward, smoothing Maya's braids. "Sweetheart, we wanted to. Because this is your home now." Maya's lips trembled. She had spent so much of her life being unwanted, but now, standing in this room, her room, she realized something incredible. She was wanted. She was loved. She belonged. Maya launched herself into Sarah's arms, then Jonathan's, and finally, Officer Barrow's. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Robert Barrow knelt to her level, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Your family now, Maya. And family means forever." Maya took a deep breath, letting those words settle into her bones. Forever. She liked the sound of that. A shadow on the horizon. That night, Maya lay in bed, staring up at the glow-in-the-dark stars Jonathan had stuck to her ceiling. For the first time in months, she felt safe. She closed her eyes, her heartbeat slowing. But just as sleep began to take her, a noise outside made her freeze. A car door. Her stomach twisted. Slowly, she crept to the window and peered out. A dark figure stood by the mailbox, just beyond the streetlight's glow. A woman. Watching. Even in the darkness, Maya knew exactly who it was. Denise. Maya's breath hitched. Denise's lips curled into a sinister smile. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. Maya stepped back from the window, her hands trembling. Jonathan's voice came from the hallway. "Maya, you okay?" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't the scared little girl who had followed Jonathan from a distance. She had a family now. Taking a deep breath, Maya turned back toward her bed. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm okay." And for the first time in a long time, she really was. The shadow that lingers. The glow-in-the-dark stars on Maya's ceiling had lost their magic. She had spent the past hour lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, but the image of Denise standing near the mailbox wouldn't leave her mind. Jonathan had knocked on her door earlier, asking if she was okay. She had told him yes, but the truth was, she wasn't sure. For the first time in months, she felt safe. She had a home. A room that was hers. A family who wanted her. So why did it feel like that safety was already slipping through her fingers? Maya hugged the stuffed bear on her bed. The same one Jonathan had given her when she first arrived. Denise couldn't take this away from her. Could she? The morning after. The next morning, Maya sat at the kitchen table, slowly stirring her cereal. She had barely taken a bite. Jonathan, sitting across from her, tilted his head. "Okay, what's up?" Maya hesitated. She glanced toward the window, sunlight streaming in. Everything looked normal, but last night's encounter felt too real to ignore. Jonathan saw her hesitation and narrowed his eyes. "Maya." Maya sighed. She was here. Jonathan blinked. "Who?" "Denise." Jonathan's chair scraped against the floor as he sat up straighter. "Wait. What? When?" "Last night," Maya whispered, gripping the spoon in her hand. "I saw her. She was standing by the mailbox, watching the house." Jonathan's stomach twisted. "Are you sure?" Maya gave him a flat look. "I know what my aunt looks like." Jonathan didn't doubt her. But why had Denise come back? And more importantly, what did she want? Telling the adults. Maya and Jonathan didn't waste time. They found Jonathan's parents in the living room, his mom folding laundry, his dad reading something on his tablet. Jonathan was the one who blurted it out first. "Maya saw Denise outside last night." Sarah froze. Officer Barrow slowly lowered his tablet. His face was calm, but Maya could see the sharpness in his eyes. "When?" "Late," Maya murmured. She was standing by the mailbox, just staring at the house. Then she walked away. Sarah immediately walked over and cupped Maya's face. "Are you okay?" Maya nodded, but the way Sarah's fingers trembled against her cheek told her she was worried. Officer Barrow exhaled, rubbing his chin. That woman just doesn't know when to quit. He stood up, already pulling out his phone. I'll check the security footage. Maya's breath hitched. You have cameras. Jonathan grinned. Dad's a cop. Of course we have cameras. That made Maya feel a little better. Caught on camera. 15 minutes later, they were all huddled in front of Officer Barrow's laptop. The footage played in black and white, a clear view of the street. Then, at 1:47 a.m., the motion sensors triggered. A shadow moved into view. Maya's stomach flipped. There she was. Denise stood near the mailbox, her posture stiff, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't move for almost a full minute, just stood there, watching. Then she tilted her head slightly and smirked. The expression made Maya's skin crawl. Denise lingered for another few seconds before turning sharply and walking away. Sarah let out a shaky breath. Why would she come here? Jonathan scowled. To be creepy. Maya swallowed. To remind me she's still there. Officer Barrow's jaw tightened. Well, now we know she was here. He sat back in his chair. And we're going to make sure she never comes back. Maya looked up at him. How? His expression was grim. By making it impossible for her to do anything else. Filing for a restraining order. That afternoon, Maya, Jonathan, and his parents drove to the police station. Maya had been inside police stations before. When she was little, her dad used to take her to visit his station. He'd let her sit in his chair, eat donuts, and listen to funny stories from his coworkers. But today felt different. She wasn't here as an officer's daughter. She was here as a victim. Officer Barrow led them inside, his badge flashing as he greeted other officers. One of them, a woman with short, dark hair, gave Maya a soft smile. You must be Maya. Maya nodded, feeling small. Officer Barrow turned to her. Maya, this is Sergeant Lopes. She's handling your case. Maya swallowed. My case. Sergeant Lopes crouched slightly so they were at eye level. Sweetheart, I know this is scary, but we're here to make sure you're safe. That's why we're filing for a restraining order against your aunt. Maya's breath caught. A restraining order. That meant Denise couldn't come near her. She couldn't take her away. Jonathan nudged her lightly. See, she can't win. Maya let out a shaky breath. Okay. For the next hour, Sergeant Lopes and Officer Barrow went through paperwork, explaining everything to Maya in simple terms. If the judge grants the restraining order, Sergeant Lopes explained, Denise won't be able to come near you, the Barrow family, or even the school. Jonathan's mom reached over and squeezed Maya's hand. She won't touch you again, sweetheart. Maya wanted to believe that. But deep down, something still felt unfinished. A visit to her past. A week later, Officer Barrow drove Maya and Jonathan to a place Maya never thought she'd return to. Her aunt's old apartment complex. The plan was simple. Talk to more neighbors. Get more evidence. Strengthen their case. But the second Maya stepped out of the car, her stomach dropped. Everything looked exactly the same. The peeling paint, the rusted stair railings, the faint smell of garbage mixed with cigarettes. It was her old life, and she never wanted to see it again. Jonathan must have noticed her hesitation because he grabbed her hand. You okay? Maya wanted to say yes, but she wasn't. So instead, she just squeezed his hand back. Then together, they walked inside. Old faces, new truths. The first neighbor they spoke to was an older man who had lived on the first floor. She barely took care of that girl, he muttered, shaking his head. Always alone, always hungry. The second neighbor was a young woman with a baby. I remember hearing her cry through the walls, she said softly. It broke my heart. And then, just as they were about to leave, Maya. A familiar voice made Maya freeze. She turned slowly. And there, standing at the top of the stairs, was Aunt Denise. Maya's blood turned to ice. Denise's lips curled into that same twisted smirk from the security footage. Well, well, she said smoothly. Look who finally came home. Maya took a step back. Jonathan immediately stepped in front of her. But Denise wasn't looking at Jonathan. She was looking right at Maya. And her next words made Maya's skin crawl. You really think a piece of paper is going to keep me away from you? Maya's chest tightened. This wasn't over. Not yet. The final stand. The stairwell was cold, the dim lighting casting shadows across the chipped walls. Maya stood frozen, Jonathan standing protectively in front of her, as Aunt Denise's words hung in the air. You really think a piece of paper is going to keep me away from you? Maya's heart pounded. Denise stood at the top of the stairs, leaning casually against the railing, as if this was all some game to her. She looked different from how Maya remembered. Thinner, her once well-kept hair now tangled at the ends, her clothes slightly wrinkled. But her eyes, those were the same. Cold, calculating. Jonathan clenched his fists. You need to leave. Denise let out a low chuckle. Oh, look at you, playing the little hero. That's cute. Jonathan didn't budge. I mean it. Denise took a slow step down, her gaze flicking past Jonathan and landing on Maya. I bet you think you're safe now, huh? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Living in that nice house, eating their food, pretending like you're one of them. Maya's throat tightened. Denise scoffed. You really think they want you? Her voice dripped with cruelty. How long before they get tired of playing the hero and send you back? Maya felt Jonathan's anger before he even spoke. Shut up. Denise's smile widened. Hit a nerve, did I? Jonathan stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. You abandoned her. Denise's eyes flashed. You left her alone. Jonathan continued, his hands balled into fists. You didn't feed her. You locked her out in the cold. And now you have the nerve to stand here and act like you deserve to be in her life. Denise's smirk faltered, just slightly. Jonathan didn't stop. She's not alone anymore. She has a family now. A real one. One that actually loves her. Maya felt tears welling in her eyes. Jonathan wasn't just standing up for her. He was claiming her as his family. Denise's expression darkened. You think you're so smart, don't you? Officer Barrow's voice rang out before she could say another word. I suggest you take a step back, Denise. Maya whipped her head around. Her heart soared when she saw Officer Barrow standing at the entrance, hands on his belt, his police badge catching the dim light. Behind him, Sergeant Lopes and another uniformed officer flanked the doorway. Denise went stiff. Officer Barrow wasn't playing games. Denise Watson, you are in direct violation of the temporary restraining order placed against you. If you take one more step toward Maya, you'll be arrested. Denise scoffed but didn't move. Restraining order? Please, you think I'm scared of some paperwork? Sergeant Lopes stepped forward. No, but you should be scared of what comes next. She pulled a thick file from under her arm and held it up. Inside were witness statements, police reports, and evidence of Denise's neglect. Maya saw Mrs. Patel's handwritten notes, the testimonies from the neighbors, the official child services report. Denise's face paled. You're done, Officer Barrow said firmly. We have enough evidence to file criminal charges for child endangerment and neglect. I suggest you leave now before we do it right here. For the first time, real fear flickered across Denise's face. She looked at Maya, her expression unreadable. Then she turned on her heel and walked away. Maya exhaled, her chest heaving, as Denise disappeared into the shadows. It was over. This time, for real. Officially home. 3 weeks later, Maya stood in a different courtroom. This time, she wasn't fighting for survival. She was fighting for something better. Officer Barrow had filed for full legal adoption. And today was the final hearing. Maya sat between Jonathan and his mother, their hands tightly clasped together. Officer Barrow stood beside them, his uniform neatly pressed, his eyes steady but filled with something warm. The judge, A woman with kind eyes adjusted her glasses. Maya Thompson, you have expressed your desire to remain with the Barrow family permanently. Is that correct? Maya nodded firmly. Yes, Mom. The judge smiled. And the Barrow family has expressed their intent to legally adopt you, providing you with full rights as their daughter. Officer Barrow cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. Jonathan's mom wiped away tears. Absolutely. The judge's eyes softened as she looked at Maya. And Maya, do you accept this adoption? Do you want to become a part of the Barrow family forever? Maya's voice wavered, but she spoke with all the strength she had. Yes. The judge smiled. Then it is my honor to grant this adoption. From this day forward, Maya Thompson shall be known as Maya Barrow. Jonathan cheered. His mom cried. His dad hugged Maya so tight she thought she might burst. And Maya laughed. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole. She wasn't just a kid bouncing from home to home. She was a Barrow. She was safe. She was loved. And she was finally home. Forever.